All right, we can start the introductions, please.
Good evening. My name is Freddie Perlmutter, and I am co-chair of the Adult Education Committee, along with Moshe Margolin. Tonight, we're bringing you a different type of education program. This is the first of a two-part series on climate change that we are co-sponsoring with the Social Action Committee. You'll hear more about part 2 at the end of the program, but we all recognize what an important topic this is today. When we were planning this program, I consulted Rabbi Mero, and she suggested that we contact Rabbi Rosenn. And having spoken with Rabbi Rosenn a couple of times now, I'm very glad that she did. We hope once these programs are over that we'll have a better idea of how we can deal with climate change. First, though, some ground rules. Number 1, I think we've muted everybody, but if we haven't, please keep yourself on mute. Questions. We're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. If you have questions, put them in the chat and put them either to Lynn Cooper-Smith or to me, Freddie Perlmutter, and we'll pass them along to Rabbi Rosenn. I'm not going to take up any more of your time now, but what we're going to do first, Rabbi Mero is going to greet her friend and colleague, Rabbi Rosenn, and then my co-chair for this program, Lynn Cooper-Smith, who worked very hard to put this program together, is going to introduce Rabbi Rosenn. Rabbi Mero?
It's great to be with another sister, fellow traveler, someone whose career I've watched from the beginning of her career. And she has done amazing things in the rabbinate and in the world. And so I am thrilled that you agreed to speak to our community. And as I said, you are the first of any of my acquaintances, friends, folks to come in. So join me in Dayenu as you present to us your wisdom and how we can use our Jewish wisdom to be stewards of the earth. Amen. So happy that you said yes.
So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Rabbi Jennie Rosenn is the founder and CEO of Dayenu, a new organization that is truly at the heart of tonight's program. But before founding Dayenu, Rabbi Rosenn served as vice president for community engagement at HIAS, where she built a robust Jewish movement responding to the global refugee crisis. And prior to her work at HIAS, Rabbi Rosenn spent nearly a decade growing the Jewish social justice movement as the director of Jewish Life and Values program at the Nathan Cummings Foundation. There, she built the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable and the Selah program, leadership training program, while spearheading initiatives to cultivate the environmental movement and women as agents of change in Israel. She has also served as rabbi at Columbia Barnard Hillel, a founding board member of Avodah, the Jewish Service Corps, and Repair the World, and on the boards of the Jewish Funders Network and New York Jobs with Justice. Rabbi Rosenn was ordained by Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, where she was a Wexner Graduate Fellow. Without further ado, a very warm welcome to you, Rabbi Rosenn.
Thank you. I'm really honored and delighted to be here. Rabbi Mero and I have been colleagues, well, since before we were rabbis. And of course, the Jewish Center of Princeton is a community that is well known in the tri-state area. So I'm really, really honored to be here. And thank you for the opportunity to talk together and learn together about the climate crisis and a Jewish response to the climate crisis. I want to start by saying this isn't an easy topic. And I think it's very natural for a lot of feelings to come up when you think about spending the next hour plus talking and thinking and feeling about the climate crisis. So I want to just invite you to take a minute, take a deep breath. If you're comfortable, just check in with yourself. And knowing that we're about to talk about the climate crisis and about climate change and about climate action, what are you feeling right now? And if you're comfortable, I invite you to share in the chat just a word or two of what's coming up for you. Does someone who can see the chat want to share? Oh, here we go. Sadness, hope, dread, tikkun. Other words that are coming up that folks can see in their chat? Anxiety, sadness, a feeling of powerlessness, hope, catastrophe, hopeful. We each have our own journeys, our intellectual journeys, spiritual journeys, when it comes to awakening to the climate crisis. And I imagine that for some of you, you've been on this journey for a long time. And for others, this really marks the beginning of a newer conversation. So I want to start by just sharing a little bit about my own story. Frank, I'm going to ask if you unshare the screen. I think we'll all be able to see each other even better. Thank you. So I grew up in a family with a strong Jewish identity, where part of what it meant to be a Jew was to be engaged in the world and working for social justice. And I really became a rabbi and have worked for more than 2 decades to mobilize the American Jewish community to address issues of social and economic justice. And for me, that always meant issues having to do with people, poverty, immigrants and refugees, hunger. I think, like many people, I thought of the environment as something a little bit out there. I liked hiking. I liked the outdoors. I gave tzedakah to environmental organizations, but I was less viscerally connected to environmental issues. And this started to change for me. I think there are a few different things that contributed to my awakening. You know, you look back when something happens and you think, how did I get there? I remember reading reports of the climate crisis and realizing that this was coming much faster and much more furiously than I'd realized. And that terrified me, to realize that without major change, we were hurtling towards climate collapse in my lifetime, and that the future of my children, let alone my grandchildren, was in peril. Would there be enough food to eat? Will there be enough water to drink, clean air to breathe? I felt a little bit like, where had I been? People have been talking about this for years. How did I not really get it? And at the time, I was working at HIAS, and I was hearing stories of refugees and witnessing their pain, and imagining that we could have 1 billion climate refugees, which is the number that experts are predicting if we don't make massive change. 1 billion climate refugees, it was unfathomable. And then I think the last piece in my own awakening came from an experience I had visiting my father in his home in San Francisco. It was August, and the week we visited, there was a terrible heat wave in San Francisco, which a minor event in the scheme of climate events, but it was unbearable in the city. And San Francisco, what does Mark Twain say? The coldest winter I ever had was a summer in San Francisco. San Francisco is not used to having heat in the summer, and it completely shut down. The city just could not function. And I remember thinking that it felt a little apocalyptic. I was also coming to realize that the climate crisis at its core is a social, economic, and racial justice issue. It is about people and about who's bearing the brunt of climate change already and who will be most severely impacted. So as I was integrating this reality of what it means to live in this moment of climate emergency, I was also having conversations with colleagues and friends about how the American Jewish community was not currently mobilized in all our people in power to confront the crisis, that there wasn't an organized effort at the scale that's needed to respond. This is the existential crisis of our time. And for a variety of reasons, the Jewish community was not fully showing up. So I'll be honest, I was not looking to start a new organization in my early 50s. I knew that launching a startup was risky. It takes thick skin, which I don't really have. And I asked myself, am I up for this? And I thought, no, I'm really not. And I still need to do it. We're living in a time when we all need to do things that are uncomfortable, that are a little bit outside our comfort zone. This is the existential crisis on which I don't think it's hyperbole to say the future of humanity depends. And we have no choice but to give it everything we've got. And for me, that meant founding Dayenu and building a movement of Jews who are working together with other communities to confront the climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political and collective action. I imagine that many of you have your own stories of awakening, either long ago or more recently. I'm curious, just by a show of hands, how many of you are more concerned about the climate crisis now than you were, say, 5 years ago? Yeah. That's not surprising, right? We know the science. We read the staggering predictions of sea rise. We feel the record heat, the high temperatures. We witness fires and floods and hurricanes that are wreaking havoc across our nation and across the globe. And we know that without very significant changes, we're hurtling towards an unlivable and unsustainable future. And many are already experiencing that. Many are already experiencing the painful impacts of climate change. And I think this fall, Hurricane Ida really brought this crisis very close to home for many of us gathered tonight. But even before the coronavirus pandemic hit, even before then, we knew our world was broken. We knew that we couldn't just continue as we had been and expect that future generations would have a safe planet to live on. But at the same time, I think that the deep disruption that's been caused by the coronavirus pandemic, I think that's put some of these truths into even sharper focus. We've experienced how we are profoundly interconnected. We have knowledge, like real knowledge of what disruption feels like, of what happens when governments fail to prepare and respond adequately, what happens when we don't listen to science. And I think the pandemic has awakened even the most comfortable among us to the fragility of our systems. It's like many of us are getting in our kishkas in a new way, the threat of climate collapse. But in another way, this disruption, this destruction, has given us a new opportunity, an opportunity to re-envision and rebuild a different world, not to bolster the same unjust economies and polluting infrastructures, but to dream of something different, to envision and bring to life something profoundly different. And of course, this time we're in right now is not only being shaped by climate change, it's not only being shaped by the pandemic, but the uprising for Black lives has put into sharper relief for many the systemic racism that pulses through our nation. It's heightened our awareness of the insidiousness of white supremacy and how Black, Brown, and Indigenous people bear the weight of injustice. And this is true when it comes to climate as well. The impacts of the climate crisis, rest disproportionately on those who've been historically marginalized, right? So people living in the global South, in poverty, in particularly vulnerable areas, and people who are experiencing racism and other kinds of bigotry. It's almost like the climate crisis is a force multiplier. It exacerbates historical inequities, even as it impacts everyone. Doesn't affect us all equally, but no one will be exempt. It's a little bit like the coronavirus in some ways. Regardless of wealth or skin color, no one's safe from it, but its impacts are felt differently for different people. I think that confronting the climate crisis and doing this in a way that's spiritually rooted means recognizing that truth of our interconnectedness. And it also means recognizing this opportunity we've been given to re-envision and rebuild a different kind of future. And we as Jews, we have faced existential crises, disruption, and destruction many times throughout our history. And each time we've not only survived, but we have built a different future. Each time we've had to create a very new kind of existence. I also think that confronting the climate crisis from as a Jew and from a place of values and spirit, it also means recognizing and honoring the way that this issue can be just so overwhelming. It's really difficult to face the truth of what's at stake. It can feel like too much to take in. And so we disassociate, or we distract ourselves, or we turn away. We get busy with our day-to-day lives and our to-do lists and our responsibilities and our reading and our Netflix. And it's like too much for our souls and psyches to bear. We have such deep fears and anxiety about what the future holds. And I imagine that among us gathered here tonight, there's some differences in how we're experiencing this. I think as a people, there's also some differences generationally. It's always risky to make generalizations, but I also think it's worth reflecting that for those in the later third of their life, or boomers, I think many feel a sense of sadness and guilt about what they're leaving to the next generation, and an awareness that they won't be here necessarily to bear the worst of what's ahead. I think for millennials and Gen Z kids, like my own kids, this is all they've ever known. Many in this generation are angry. Some feel hopeless or even a sense of nihilism. But this is also the generation that's leading the way with a clear voice and a powerful mobilization and calling older generations to account. And then Generation X, it's called the forgotten generation. For us, the world's not as we thought it was. The narrative that we grew up with, that you keep working for things to keep getting better and better, turned out to be completely wrong. So in addition to worrying about our children or their grandchildren, many of us are also mourning the world as we knew it or as we thought it was. These are all, of course, generalizations, and each person is facing the climate crisis in their own unique way. But I think many of us are also asking a few basic questions. How do we live during this time? How do we face the truth? What's going to happen to us, to our earth, to future generations? And what can I possibly do? Research shows that 80% of American Jews are concerned or very concerned about the climate crisis. This is actually a statistic from 2 years ago, and I would suspect, just based on national trends, that it's higher now. And a survey in 2020 actually showed that climate was the #1 issue among Jewish voters. I was surprised to learn that. But most of these 80% of American Jews are not taking meaningful action on climate. And I think there are two main reasons for that. One is I think people aren't sure what they can do to make a difference in the face of such an overwhelming and complex issue. And the second, as I just spoke about, I think it's difficult to face the truth of what's at stake on an emotional level, on a psychological level, on a religious level. How can we make sense of this? So we launched Dayenu about 20 months ago to give American Jews pathways to take the kind of meaningful strategic action at the scale that science and justice demand, to support Jews and Jewish communities and Jewish institutions to face and move through the anxiety and angst that the climate crisis raises. So rooted in Jewish values and experience and spirit, Dayenu's mission is to secure a livable, sustainable world for all people for generations to come by building a multi-generational Jewish movement that's confronting the climate crisis, we like to say, with spiritual audacity and bold collective action. So we're mobilizing Jewish support for climate solutions. We're building our collective power with national and global movements, and we're raising up a spiritual, religious, and moral voice. Now, sometimes people ask, why do we need a Jewish climate movement? So I want to just address that for a moment. As you all know so well, there are many Jewish values that call us to rise to the challenge of the climate crisis. We have the classic values like Shomrei Adama, protecting the earth, and Bal Tashchit, the prohibition to waste. Those are the classic ones we most often hear, but there are so many others. B'charta b'chaim, choose life. Tirdof tzedek, pursue justice. And Shomer ger yatom v'almana, protecting the vulnerable. And of course, at its most basic, addressing the climate crisis is about the very concept of living l'dor v'dor. Will the generations continue? And what kind of lives will they have? These are just a few of the values. I am sure you can think of many other Jewish values that root this work. I also think there are other reasons for a Jewish communal response. There is a diverse movement of people fighting for climate justice, including faith groups, Black, Brown, and Indigenous community, young people. We need every part of the diverse American community, including the Jewish community, in this. We're only 2% of the population, and yet the Jewish community has a very strong voice in American society and politics. This is an all hands on deck moment, and none of us can set this out. Furthermore, I think that religious voices have an important role to play in shaping our national narratives and solutions. Faith communities play a critical role in ensuring the centrality of certain values in how we understand and address the issue. Are we centering human dignity and social justice and the public good? And there's a power in spiritually rooted activism. We're bringing Jewish history and experience and teaching and tradition and faith and song to the movement. It's not just a series of tactics, but a movement that's rooted in community, sustaining ourselves and each other for the work ahead. Our Torah and history as a people are among the things that can sustain us, that can empower us, that can give us courage. We think of Nachshon walking into the water up to his nose to part the sea, the midwives risking their lives to birth babies, Esther saving the Jewish people, Jewish workers and organizers who came together to build many of the first labor unions in this country at the beginning of the century, striking together for basic workers' rights, partisans who banded together to fight the Nazis and the ghetto uprising, Refusnik, and the power we amassed to freedom. It is all the social movements of the past decades that Jews have been part of leading. And of course, the story at the core of the Jewish people's narrative is the journey out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt, or literally a narrow place, a place of oppression and genocide, like so many peoples have faced. While we were wandering in the desert, God reminds us that the path forward and our redemption is not in heaven or beyond our reach. Lo b'shamayim hi. Our redemption is in our hands. In Deuteronomy, God says, it's not too baffling for you or beyond your reach. It is not in the heavens or beyond the sea. No, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart to do it. The future of the world is in our hands. It's in our hands as in it's up to us. And it's also in our hands. We have the capacity. We have the science. We have the resources. We have the people, and we have the power. We have the opportunity to close the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. Not incrementally, not by moving the two slowly together, but by reimagining and rebuilding a different future. Now is really a moment for bold, courageous action. And so I want to look together at two very different responses in the Torah to the threat of complete destruction. First, in the time before the flood, the Torah tells us that Noah was a righteous man. Frank, I'm going to ask if you can share the slide with the first set of texts on it. Noah was a righteous man, the only tamim, pure, innocent, blameless, it's translated a few different ways, person living in his generation, and he walked closely with God. So that's the pasuk. This is the line of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, he was pure in his generation, and Noah walked with God. So the Kedushat Levi, who was an 18th century Hasidic master, he wonders, how could it be that Noah is considered a righteous person? He didn't even try to talk to God. about bringing the flood. He didn't try to talk God out of it. So the Kishushat Levi teaches there is a kind of tzaddik who serves God, but is so lowly in their own eyes that they think to themselves, who am I to pray for God to reverse God's bad decree? And therefore they don't pray. Now, even though Noah was a great and blameless tzaddik, he was very small in his own eyes. And he did not have the faith that he was a powerful tzaddik with the ability to annul the decree of the flood. Hayakatan ba'anav ma'od, very small in his own eyes. So here, the Kiddush Levi is actually challenging whether Noah acted as a tzaddik. He was a tzaddik in that he had the power and potential to save humanity from the flood, but he didn't act because hayakatan ba'anav ma'od, he was very small in his own eyes. On the one hand, we so often have an outsized sense of ourselves, a sense of dominion over things, which is part of how we got ourselves into the climate crisis. And yet too often, we also have a small sense of ourselves. We retreat in the face of complex or wicked problems. We succumb to feeling overwhelmed, or we think that we can only make small changes. And so we don't engage in things that are big, like climate change, at the scale that they require. But Noah lives in contrast with another leader in the Torah who faced destruction, Abraham. We advance to the next slide. So the Zohar Chadash, what is the Zohar Chadash? It's a collection from the Middle Ages of material pertaining to, but not included in the Zohar. It's material that relates to the weekly Torah portion. So in the Zohar Chadash, we find a detailed ending to Noah's story, perhaps an alternative ending, if you will. When Noah came out of the ark, he saw the world completely destroyed. He began crying and said, God, how could you have done this? Why did you destroy your world? God replied. Now you ask me? And when I said all flesh will end, you went into the house of study and didn't do anything to fix that generation of yours? In contrast to that, when God told Abraham that God would destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham stood before God and tried to save the wicked people of the city. So here, the Zohar Chadash is contrasting Noah's lack of agency with that of Abraham, who so boldly fought to protect Sodom and Gomorrah and to shift God's decree. So the tragic part of this teaching, of course, is that despite Abraham's efforts, Sodom and Gomorrah are ultimately destroyed. It's a somber reminder that we actually can't control the ultimate outcome of our efforts. Our efforts over the next 10 years, the narrow window of time we've been given to slow and avert runaway climate change, we can't control the outcomes. But our tradition comes down very clearly. Regardless of the odds, we're called to speak up, to be bold, to be the kind of tzaddik, both individually and collectively, who's big enough in our own eyes to fight for and engage in a challenge as massive as climate change's threat, and to do so with the kind of actions that are commensurate with that threat. We can unshare the screen for a little while now. So we are living really in a devastating time. And as I mentioned earlier, we faced existential crises and disruptions and destructions many times throughout history. I think perhaps one of the best examples was the destruction of the ancient temple. This is a story of radical transformation, right? The destruction of the temple meant the end of the sacrificial system and the birth of rabbinic Judaism, and is actually an incredibly powerful example of a complete paradigmatic and societal transformation. A shift from sacrificial offerings on the temple altar to a practice of deeds and prayer, the Judaism that we know today. What comes after the temple is a story of rebuilding, not the same structures, but ones that transform Jewish civilization into a new era. And we can think of many other times through history where there's been profound reinvention. And I think we are living in such a time now. And in such times, we need bold, not incremental action. We need responses and solutions at the scale that science and justice demand. Because in order to mitigate the most devastating impacts of climate change, we need to take action on a systemic level, Because while personal practices like reducing meat consumption and communal practices like greening institutions, these are important, but they are not sufficient. If every single person and institution significantly lowered their carbon footprint, we would not avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change. It's too late for that. The statistic that I think shows this most vividly is we think back to 2020, when much of the world was homebound because of the coronavirus. And we talked about we could hear the birds, the air felt cleaner, all of this was true. But daily carbon dioxide emissions only fell 7%. The other 93% of emissions are embedded in our infrastructure and economy. And to address that, we need to make change on a systemic level. So what does that mean? That means things like cutting demand for and supply of fossil fuel energy. It means advocating for comprehensive climate policy on the federal and state level. It means moving money, building a movement, changing our political landscape. Bill McKibben, the climate journalist and activist who some of you may know, he says, the climate crisis no longer yields to individual actions. There is no way to make the math work, one vegan dinner or Tesla at a time. At this point, the most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual and join movements sharp enough to make change. We need to not just focus on what car do I buy, but what cars are Detroit manufacturing? Not just where do I bank, but what are the biggest banks that are investing in the fossil fuel industry, and how do we take action on them? The fossil fuel companies actually want us to focus on our individual banking, on our individual consumer habits, and stop there. They don't want us to be thinking and believing that there's a whole other way possible. I want to share one recent example of what systemic change can look like, what it can look like when groups of Jews come together to address the climate crisis together with others on a systemic level. So over the month of Elul and through the high holidays, in 16 Jewish communities across the country, including, I should say, in Newark, New Jersey, Dayenu activists and leaders organized public actions to bring together Jews and partners at their senators' doorsteps and call them to action with the blasts of the shofar. It was the Hear the Call campaign in 13 states, giving our elected officials the courage, the moral clarity, in some cases the chizuk, the strengthening, to pass a just green recovery, what became the Build Back Better Act. So I want to share just a short 3-minute video with you about the campaign.
To take a minute and look around.
Hear our call! Hear our call!
Across 13 states, Jews are showing up at their senators' doorsteps to bring the full power and people of the Jewish community to the existential crisis of our time, the climate crisis.
The Jewish communities of Boulder and Denver held a rally today for climate change.
I want our representatives and our senators in particular to know that this is something that the Jewish community really cares about.
We gather today knowing we are one small part of a much larger movement happening across the country, from Maine to California, from Pennsylvania to Arizona.
We have to make sure Senator Sinema knows what her constituents want, what they demand of her.
Compromise in the face of climate crisis will mean our destruction.
All you have to do is look at the map. The fires in the west, the hurricanes down south, the flooding, and you know that unfortunately, global warming is getting worse and worse and worse.
And in the past year, more of us than ever have experienced this devastation firsthand.
So we are fighting for big, bold action. We have no choice if we care about our globe, if we care about our children. We have no choice.
This kind of transformational change is not inevitable. And this brings us back to the shofar. Across the nation, at Hear the Call actions and high holiday services, we have been sounding the blasts of the shofar.
We sound the call for climate action. Tekiah!
to do right now is exactly what we're commanded to do as Jewish people, take the message of climate justice throughout the world, letting it act as a beacon.
We founded Dayenu to inspire, organize, and mobilize Jews, Jewish communities, and Jewish institutions to confront the climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political action. We are building a multi-generational Jewish climate movement, doing everything in our power to avert the worst of climate devastation and build a more just and sustainable world for all people for generations to come. Enough. Enough climate destruction, enough valuing the fossil fuel industry over human lives, enough letting the impacts of climate change fall disproportionately on Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Enough. Visit Dayenu.org to learn how to get involved and join the growing Jewish climate movement.
Thanks, Frank. This is one way that action can look. It can look a lot of different ways. Showing up in key mobilization moments, pressuring banks and financial institutions to stop funding the fossil fuel industry, standing as fierce allies with frontline communities who are confronting climate injustice and devastation, working for comprehensive climate policy, meeting with members of Congress, lots of different forms it can take. But we know that if we're going to reach net zero emissions well before 2050, if we're going to avert the most catastrophic of climate impacts, what happens in the next 10 years will define our future. This is our decade of action. I think that facing the climate crisis reminds us and requires us to remember to access our collective power, because we have tremendous collective power. We can't be like Noah and be too small in our own eyes. And we do not need to do this alone. So you'll see on this map, there are now more than 90 Dayenu Circles in different stages of formation across the country. These are groups of people working on climate action with a Jewish voice in partnership with local groups and frontline communities. Many are in synagogues, some are in hillels, even neighborhoods. And Dayenu supports circles with training and coaching and resources and providing campaigns like the one you saw here to take part in. And it's a growing national network. Dayenu Circles were actually the foundation of the Hear the Call campaign that you just saw, that was calling on our leaders to pass bold climate action. And I want to say that most of those folks who organized those actions had never organized an action before. We're in a moment where everyone has something to bring to this. If we advance to the next slide, you'll see some pictures of a Dayenu Circle meeting in their sukkah on the right. And on the left, some members from Riverdale Westchester Dayenu Circle meeting with Representative Jamal Bowman. And then on this next slide, you can see some folks making calls from our Chutzpah 2020 campaign, which was an effort to get out the climate vote. And we're actually gearing up now for Chutzpah 2022 to get out the climate vote around the upcoming midterms elections. Some circles are also working on local and statewide issues with the support of Dayenu Circles. If we go to the next slide, we want to encourage you, one of the things you can do is to start a Dayenu Circle here at the Jewish Center of Princeton, or with a group of friends, or if you're here from another community. We have a lot of resources to help you get started. I have a few amazing people on my team who work day in, day out supporting Dayenu Circles. And here, listed here are a few of the folks from your community who are interested, if you were interested in being part of starting a Dayenu Circle here, that you can reach out to. No one can face the climate crisis alone. And by being part of a Dayenu Circle, you don't have to. There are some other ways that you can take immediate action. If we advance to the next slide, I want to invite you sign up with Dayenu.org just to stay abreast of upcoming opportunities. Tomorrow night we are launching our big new multi-year campaign, All Our Might, to move from fossil fuel to a clean energy future. It's at 8 o'clock. And I invite you to join us. We'll actually be joined by Bill McKibben himself for this virtual kickoff launch. And of course, supporting the Jewish climate justice work through tzedakah to Dayenu or to other organizations is always a way to power the movement, whatever your go-to climate organization is, to support them with tzedakah. Frank, I think you can unshare the slides for a little while. The most important thing is to make a commitment to move from angst to action. To take that feeling, whether it's something that wakes you up in the dark of night, or it's just a vague feeling of unease that you have about the future of our world. And commit tonight to act on those feelings, to take an action, to join thousands of Jews across the country who are part of this growing Jewish climate movement, working for a world that's livable and just and sustainable for all of us, for our children, for our grandchildren, and for generations to come, because it's going to take all of us. I want to close by just sharing with you why we named Dayenu Dayenu. Of course, you all know Dayenu, the joyous song that we sing each year at the Passover Seder. We tell the story of the Jewish people's journey from slavery to freedom. And we recount all the things that God had done for us. If God had taken us out of Egypt, but not given us the Torah, Dayenu, it would have been enough. If God had given us the Torah, but not brought us to Israel, Dayenu would have been so on. But it also means we've had enough. We've had enough destruction. We've had enough valuing fossil fuel companies over human life. We've had enough letting the impacts of climate destruction fall disproportionately on marginalized communities. Dayenu. But here's where the double entendre comes in, because it also means we have enough. We have what we need to confront the climate crisis and move towards climate solutions. We have the resources and the policy rubrics. We have the technology. We have what we need so that everyone can have enough. Now is really the time for us to join together in this urgent and sacred work. Nothing less than the future of humanity is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Rosenn. So far, if anybody has any questions, first of all, we will do that. Believe me, we're getting there. Does anyone have any questions? We have some time. Lynn, do you have any questions? Anybody send you any questions?
Not yet.
Unmute.
Yeah. I'd like to encourage everyone to put your questions in the chat, and that way we can go through them and bring forward some of those questions.
I have a question here. What does spiritual audacity actually look like in practice? Is there a role for an ecologically sustainable halecha in which we can reimagine the commitments which define our way of life as we also advocate for systemic reform?
Great questions. I hear a few questions in there. The first one is around spiritual audacity. So spiritual audacity is part of the work of being willing to sort of face this very painful truth and to move through that into courageous action. I think that it is hard to take it in. I think it's a daily practice in some ways to take it in. We talk about spiritual adaptation. We've actually developed a set of workshops that we have brought to communities that are experiential workshops to really just give people space to grapple with the spiritual, religious, existential kind of and emotional feelings of it all, grounded in Jewish sources and music, and then be able to move into courageous action, to be able to keep coming back to those feelings, but also not to get kind of overwhelmed in them, not to just sort of exit there. And I think the audacity is part of that thinking and acting big. It's part of that not being so small in our own eyes, to act with a kind of audaciousness. And I think there's a connection there between how we root ourselves spiritually, which I think also has a lot to do with rooting ourselves in a community, to take action, to not be doing this alone. So that's part of what we mean by spiritual audacity. And that goes hand in hand. You'll hear like with the chutzpah campaign, it's like, how do we have chutzpah, and how do we call on our leaders to have chutzpah, which takes some amount of, I think, spiritually rooted audacity. The second question about ecological kind of Jewish practices, we are a people that practices, right? We're always, it's about how do we live our lives day in and day out? What are our personal practices? What are our communal practices? How we live, right, at home, in our communities, in our, larger homes and larger communities, concentric circles of communities. And so I think that living in right relationship with the earth, with each other, that is all part of the practice. And I think that there are beautiful, beautiful resources, which I would encourage you to explore, around eco-Judaism and what it means to live in relationship to the earth and to creation as a Jew. And that's part of what it means to live in this time and to take in the wonder of creation. It's not all about destruction and death. It's also the joy and the love. This comes from love of creation, love of each other. So they're not in tension with each other. The reason that I am speaking so much about the kind of transformational change and action is because I think too often people stop at the personal practices piece. So it's not that we don't need that. Of course we need that. We need to live, we need to live our values. We need to do all of the things that it means to live in sustainable ways, but we can't stop there. We can't, that is not enough, because it's not at this point going to write sort of the numbers, like math. What do people say? Like math you can't negotiate with math or science. Like there's just some certain real facts that we need to face. So I see these as being in concert with each other. And the last thing I'll just say is that part of the work, certainly that Dayenu and the growing Jewish climate movement, is to root itself in climate Torah, to root itself in spiritual practices like Chutzpah 2020. Yes, it was phone banking, and we reached out to more than 750,000 voters as part of a much larger get out the vote effort. But we started every shift with a kavanah, and we ended every shift with live Jewish music, because this is also about how do we sustain ourselves and each other and our neshamas in this work.
We do have a question here, Rabbi Rosenn. Does Dayenu send out fact sheets on upcoming legislation?
Do we send out fact sheets on upcoming legislation? Yes and no, or no and yes. It's a good Jewish answer. We generally, as a national organization, and we're small, like we started less than 2 years ago, started with just me. We're now a team of 9, small but mighty. We are most focused on national campaigns. So Build Back Better, national big effort that we've totally doubled down on in many different ways over the last, really since we launched 20 months ago. There's then some key state legislation in some key states where we have a lot of Dayenu Circles and a lot of base, where we've been involved in coalition and in partnership with other groups around some key state legislation. And then as other things come up, we're often there to support Dayenu Circles that want to take action on something much more locally. But we're not, it's not like every time something comes up related to climate, we don't send something out, partly because I don't think that's how mobilization and change happens. Part of it is how do we kind of build collective power around a few key levers for change? And how do we support as a distributed leadership model, right? So these aren't Dayenu chapters with staff. It's really, we support and give resources to leaders who then in turn work with other leaders to really create more of a movement. So often within a Dayenu circle, they may be working on more specific local legislation. Rabbi Mero asked me, how does Dayenu help politicians who may not naturally be in favor of climate legislation to be more interested in working for it? It's a really good question. So Dayenu does not work to kind of radically change the minds of leaders who are, let's say, climate deniers. More and more, it's not about people who are actually denying climate change. It's more that they're putting their emphasis or their political will or their political capital somewhere else. So in many ways, it's about giving chizuk to the folks who basically think this is a problem, but may not be prioritizing it, or maybe giving in when the kind of haggling starts. You know, you think about someone like Schumer, who on the face of it, he cares about this. So like, why have a big rally in Brooklyn and get Schumer to actually come to it? Because he actually made statements at that action that you saw that he hadn't made before. That then we were able, that's sort of on the record, that we were then able to share with other organizations, that we were then able to meet with his staff and say, remember when Schumer, right? Because he's then at the negotiating tables around Build Back Better. So for someone like Schumer, it's about giving him chizuk. It's about backing, you know, helping him understand that this is a priority for the Jewish community. So I think, you know, if we get to a point where we have gotten everyone who cares about this to go all the way, maybe then we will have the capacity to turn to those who need to be convinced. But like the 80% of American Jews, we're not really that focused on the 20% who are not concerned about climate. It's more like, how do we get those 80% to actually be mobilized collectively?
I have, you got fan there. What kinds of issues are existing Dayenu Circles working on? And then are there other Jewish organizations working on climate, and how does Dayenu fit in with them?
Great questions. So Dayenu Circles are working on all sorts of things. Many work on whatever on the national campaigns. So when there was Chutzpah 2020, Hear the Call, or we're now about to launch All Our Might. And many Dayenu Circles will be organizing actions around All Our Might, which is really focused on keeping fossil fuel in the ground and building a clean energy future. Then some of them are working in coalitions locally. So there are a set of Dayenu Circle, for example, in Connecticut, who are working on some local infrastructure, fossil fuel infrastructure there. There's a set that was working with many partners in Northern California around a critical California bill. There's some who are meeting with their representatives and building relationships in a more ongoing sort of way. There's some who are, one of the things that we're really working to support Dayenu Circles is to partner with local frontline communities. So folks who have been working on climate justice issues very locally. So for example, climate groups in Newark who've been working on issues of pollution and asthma. How can the Jewish community stand in allyship with them? And so supporting Dayenu Circles to build those relationships in ways that are authentic and helpful, as opposed to just sort of like barging in and being like, we're the Jews, we're here, how can we help? Like, that's not a way to really build authentic relationship. Trying to think of some other, and then there's some who are working on some more hyper local things that are happening in their climate issues that are happening in their town. So there's really a range. And they're in conversation with each other also. So when there are statewide things that come up, they can engage. In terms of other Jewish organizations working on climate, there are several that come to mind. One is that both Jewish Climate Action Network in Massachusetts and Jewish Climate Action Network in New York City, mostly on the Upper West Side, are both local Jewish climate organizations. We work in close partnership with them. And so, for example, JCAN New York works very closely with New York Renews, which is a coalition of many New York City organizations and New York State organizations on climate. And JCAN New York is really kind of grassroots on the ground around New York State issues. JEA, totally blanking on what the acronym is, but focus.
Assembly?
What'd you say?
Jewish Educators Assembly?
No, it's, it'll come to me. They are working mostly on delivering letters to Congress. They're DC based, focusing on kind of having letter writing to Congress is kind of their main tactic, and they're very focused on that. And then Rosenn, which is the biggest Jewish environmental organization, is really a great resource around how do we green our institutions? How do we make, like you mentioned, Rabbi Mero, putting solar panels on the roof of your shul. Rosenn is the really go-to around sustainability and greening of Jewish institutions and Jewish life. So those are some of the other folks doing climate work that come to mind.
Do the circles work with coordinate with each other on topics? Do they consult with each other, or are they pretty independent?
They are independent, but like I said, they often will come together for an action. So for example, in several of here are the call actions that you saw, a few different Dayenu Circles came together to work on them. Or I just heard today about a set of Dayenu Circles coming together around the Passover actions that they're planning, or to meet with a local representative. Several different Dayenu Circles might come together. And then we generally have like office hours and times to kind of consult with staff. And so that's another place where a lot of different Dayenu Circle leaders will come together, or trainings is another place.
Following up on some the theme here, it seems that there are, and happily so, there are lots of small organizations or small efforts. I shouldn't say small, but separate organizations that are working on different aspects of climate change. So it's all good and hopefully impactful. But do you think that that can be brought to scale to the point that we need a larger scale effort? And is it possible to even attempt to coordinate more of what these many disparate groups are doing?
Well, so you just asked about Jewish climate groups. Obviously, there are hundreds and hundreds of climate organizations in the United States. And like any field, it's an ecosystem, right? So some organizations, in the same way there's an ecosystem of educational organizations or gun control organizations. You can take any issue, and there is, hopefully, in a healthy ecosystem, a lot of different organizations that have different areas of expertise that are working in concert, right? That's kind of living the dream. That doesn't always happen, partly because often different organizations have different theories of change, believe different ways, think that there are different levers to pull. So that's where you don't always have everyone pulling in exactly the same direction, but it's also where efforts complement each other. So I think that there is working collaboratively is so important. So for example, Dayenu has partnered, I think, over the last years with 160 different organizations, Jewish organizations, faith organizations, climate organizations, and understand ourselves as one small part of a much larger movement. I mean, that's how movements happen. So I think the scale comes from movement building. The scale comes from also thinking about what is our contribution to the larger effort. And the example I'll give is the Chutzpah 2020 campaign. So the 2020 election, what was that, $1 billion election? Huge effort. So our question was, what is our piece of that? What can we as a Jewish climate organization bring to that? So we identified 6 states, and we looked at Jewish voters, and we looked at low propensity climate voters. We took a few different files and put them together and really zeroed in on low propensity climate voters and Jewish voters in those 6 states, right? So that was our piece of the much larger effort. And we did that in partnership with several different organizations. So I think that's like an example of where you really want to understand what's your piece of the movement. And that's how we reach scale. And part of the distributed leadership model is to begin to build some of that scale. So for example, this weekend, we're doing a training. We just finished a training with 100 young adults, ages 18 to 32, called Taking Down Goliath, a virtual training. And they now are all going out to work with their people. And we have actually an in-person training in Philly this weekend for young people in partnership with Penn Hillel. And the idea is that those students will then be able to train other students. So that's another example of how we can reach scale.
Thanks.
The great question.
I have a question here, a somewhat different aspect. Do you find resistance to climate change at the local, county, state, and federal level?
So we don't, Dayenu as a national organization doesn't we ourselves are not at the local county level, although some of our Dayenu circles are. I think, I don't even quite know how to fully parse that question. I think that there is, growing recognition. It is getting harder and harder and harder to ignore the reality of climate change and the devastation of it. I think there is sometimes resistance to, I don't know if it's resistance. I think there's a kind of denial or delay that is part of what is sometimes encountered. More than it's outright resistance to the reality of climate change. I think that even among Republicans, and we're seeing more and more with very young Republicans, and I say Republicans because classically that has been the divide, the partisan divide, and clearly there's still some partisan divides, but we're seeing, among younger Republicans who a generation ago would have been climate deniers, absolutely not the case anymore. And we also work in coalition and in partnership with a lot of different organizations. So part of it is how do we show up bringing the Jewish community to multi-faith tables? So like I have a colleague who works with evangelicals around climate, a group that, has been not always so engaged, but now there's a whole effort around engaging evangelicals, around climate. And then we partner in multi-faith efforts. So I think we're in a moment of pretty big change, not for good reason, but because it's just becoming more and more explicit.
Thank you. Lynn, do you have anything more?
You've talked a lot about, it was great to see your video because that was, I thought, inspirational. But and you've talked about Chuck Schumer and other successes. Can you describe one particular success based on your efforts at a national level?
So I'm feeling a little, I don't know if superstitious is the right word, but first of all, I think it's hard I would never want to claim credit for something that is a huge movement effort. So it's generally impossible to know, we could never say we single-handedly brought a piece of legislation across the finish line, or that's not how it works. So we have all sorts of metrics by which we measure kind of indicators for success. Mm-hmm. So, getting 100 young adults to do a 3-part training on Jewish climate organizing is like an example of a kind of indicator. Around Build Back Better, we have, here are the call actions were really around Build Back Better. And we continue to really work behind the scenes to get it across the finish line. We remain hopeful that while stripped, in part because of lobbying by fossil fuel companies and all other sorts of reasons, stripped of many of its size and many of its care provisions, the Build Back Better Act, we're hopeful that there will still be $550 billion for climate, which will be the biggest historic investment in clean energy. Certainly can't claim that as a success. It hasn't happened yet, but it is still very much in play. And it wouldn't be our success, Dayenu, it would be our success as a movement, and Dayenu played a pretty critical role in it. A sobering fact is that we learned from one of our coalition partners that Dayenu's organizing was about 10% of the kind of organizing for Build Back Better, sort of public actions around Build Back Better and pressure on politicians. That's very sobering because we should not be doing 10% of what's happening, little, Jewish Dayenu. But it also reflects the importance and the scale and the role that you really can have. You know, I sometimes think about Israel and the way that, like, what happens in Israel, you can have such an outsized effect in Israel because it's such a small country. And I think that we sometimes underestimate the way that even in a country as big as America, we can actually have real impact. And so I think the way that we have played a role in Build Back Better is a success. We obviously haven't taken it across the finish line, and it'll be a collective success, God willing.
Great. So we do have another question. Are you familiar with climate restoration, which focuses less on putting less carbon into the atmosphere and more on removing carbon from the atmosphere and sequestering it in concrete, for example? Good question, Sam. Thank you.
Yeah, so there are a lot of technologies, and carbon sequestering is one of them, that are part of the equation. And I think that as with anything, we need to both scale the technologies and understand that it is not, the obstacles are not really technological obstacles. Like, we have the technology. The question is, can we invest in it and scale it and have a just transition from a fossil fuel based energy system, transportation system, infrastructure to clean energy? And there's no silver bullet. And I think that we're going to need all of these different technologies to get us there.
Lynn, I'm out of questions. I have no more questions. Do you, Lynn?
I don't see any others.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Yes, there's one coming up, Rabbi Rosenn. It's on your agenda, though, about local circles being created.
I'm not sure what the question is.
The question is, what can we do locally? Is there some organizing going on here?
Yeah, so the Dayenu Circles, you mean about forming Dayenu Circles in your community?
Yes, I think that's what the questioner was asking about.
So there is not currently a Dayenu Circle in the Princeton area. There's some in other parts of New Jersey. You can go onto the Dayenu website to see all of the existing Dayenu Circles. I will also say that there are about another 50 that are in different stages of formation. But when I checked in with our organizing team before this call, they're at the ready. If you either as a shul or as a shul, and if there are folks here from other communities, or if there's a group of friends or a neighborhood, we actually have a few where people have gotten together in the neighborhood, I think also outside because of COVID, to form a Dayenu Circle. We have a set of resources. I can share the link in the chat, or actually in the follow-up email that I think will be shared from the shul, with resources for starting Dayenu Circles. And then we have a few amazing people on the team who, once you have a group together, would be happy to work with you further to create a Dayenu Circle.
And maybe, I don't know, Frank, if we're able to get that slide up with.
Would you like me to bring that up?
Before we end, yes. Yeah.
And while that's going on, I just want, before, I know that you have some closing remarks, Freddie. Right. I want to mention that, I think I mentioned that we're building sort of climate Torah and music and ways to really sort of resource the movement. And one of the things we realized is there was not a lot of Jewish climate music. So we put out a call this spring. We have 4 JTS interns, and one of them is our music and ritual intern, which has been amazing. And they put out a call to sort of Jewish songwriters through all sorts of Jewish songwriters networks to write new Jewish climate music. So we got 40 submissions, various degrees of quality, as you can imagine. And we produced a playlist of 22 of them. And then 2 of them we produced more professionally. And then they each made a video of their various songs. So after the kind of closing announcements, I wanted to just close tonight by sharing the song of one of these talented young songwriters and musicians, Rena Branson. Her song is called L'Ador Vador, From Generation to Generation, because at the end of the day, this work is really about ensuring that we have a future generation and that life can continue L'Ador Vador from generation to generation. So thank you for this opportunity to learn together. And I'm going to hand it back to you, Freddie.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you, Rabbi Rosenn, for this very, very informative program. And I hope that our audience are all inspired to take a more active role and hopefully to join a Dayenu Circle. I want to thank Rabbi Mero for when I asked her for somebody to speak on this topic, recommending you. I want to thank everybody that actually is here for attending what I thought was a wonderful program, an inspiring program, and I hope you did too. The other thing I want to say, I think I mentioned in the very beginning, is that this was part one of our two programs on climate change. The second program, which will look more at some of the local issues, and I probably will do some of the national ones as well, is called Climate Impacts Near and Far. And the speakers will be Ben Strauss and Jennie, and that's on March 8th. So I hope that you'll take whatever we do now and follow that. And Rabbi Mero, what would I see your hand
I just
up?
want to add, very interesting, Ben Strauss, Dr. Ben Strauss, who's a climate scientist, also worked at the Nathan Cummings Foundation, but before you got there. So he's on tonight and was really happy to share that as well. If folks are interested in forming something here, please let our social action chairs know. Thank you, Rabbi Rosenn.
Thank you. We will have some names for you also when we circulate the other information that Rabbi Rosenn is putting out. I think we decided on Friday we should be looking for that. The one other thing I want to talk about.
We have a slide on this too, Freddie. After the song, I'll put that back up.
Okay. We'll have some names after the song. I want to shift gears a little bit though and tell you a little bit about another adult education committee program that we're going to have. We have a series called the Global Education. And on Sunday, February 27th, Rabbi Michael Shudrich, who's the chief rabbi of Poland, will speak about 21st century Marano's Polish Jewry today. So we hope that you'll find that interesting. And then look out, we have a number of very interesting programs planned for March, and I'm not going to tell you all of them, but I think you can look them up, and we hope that you will come for that as well. So I want to thank you all for coming. And I'd like now to, we'll hear Rabbi Rosenn's music.
L'Ador Vador Vador, L'Ador Vador Vador, L'Ador Vador, ancestors sing from the waters. L'Ador Vador, children shout from the trees. Generations to come demand that we act now to heal the earth, for all to thrive under the sun. L'Ador Vador, ancestors share their wisdom. L'Ador Vador, children take the lead. Generations to come demand that we act now to heal the earth, for all to thrive under the sun. L'Ador Vador Vador.
Thank you again, Rabbi Rosenn. And we will now, Frank, you want to put up those names if anybody wants them?
Give me a second, I have to get that slide.
Well, while he's looking for that, we will have the names also, as I say, in the mailing that you're going to be getting. And we want to thank everybody for coming.
Coming up.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our chairs.
Good night,
We got this,
everybody.
we got this in sight,
Mhm.
the circle follow-up contacts.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
You're welcome.
So just to say, we had added one more contact, thanks to Tirza, but Freddie and I will be sending out a little summary email to everyone who participated today. And we'll have all three names that will serve as our contacts and the additional information that Rabbi Rosenn will be sharing with us. So look for that in your inbox. Thank you.
If anybody else wants to form a Dayenu Circle, let us know. We'd be happy to have your name.
Yeah.
Good night.
Okay.
Stopping the recording now.